The fire roared between them, its fierce orange tongues licking the night air, throwing wild, dancing shadows across the gritty expanse of sand. She sat cross-legged, her bare shoulders gleaming with a sheen of sweat that caught the light like liquid gold, her hair a chaotic cascade of tangles, sculpted by the relentless salt water and wind. He watched her from the opposite side of the blaze, his stare heavy as stone, piercing through the flickering glow with an intensity that pinned her in place. The air crackled with something electric, a volatile force simmering between them, too potent to name, too dangerous to ignore. She shifted, her legs whispering against the sand. A subtle movement that drew his gaze like a predator tracking prey. Her skin shimmered in the firelight, kissed by the golden hues, her lips parted ever so slightly, poised on the edge of a breath. A plea, a dare. He leaned forward, his rough hands clamping onto the jagged edge of the driftwood log he perched on, his knuckles blanching white under the strain. The silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating, broken only by the far-off thunder of waves slamming against the shore, a relentless heartbeat echoing their own. Her eyes flicked up, locking with his, and in that heartbeat, the world tilted. The tension taut as a bowstring stretched to its breaking point, shattered with a visceral snap. He rose to his feet, his movements slow, deliberate, a hunter closing in, and she surged up to meet him, fearless and defiant. The distance between them evaporated, consumed by the searing heat of the fire and the scalding pull of their bodies. His hands seized her waist, fingers digging into her flesh with a possessive hunger, her arms snaked around his neck, pulling him down as their lips crashed together in a collision that felt like destiny carved in fire. The blaze seemed to flare higher, its light flaring as their bodies tangled, driven by a desperate, ravenous need, a primal dance of survival and surrender. The sand beneath them was a cold, gritty counterpoint to the furnace of their skin. A fleeting shock against the heat that consumed them. Her breath caught, a sharp gasp escaping as his hands roamed her curves, mapping her with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She clung to him, her nails raking down his back, leaving trails of fire in their wake. There was no room for thought, no space for doubt, only the raw, unfiltered instinct to merge, to feel, to defy the emptiness that had brought them here. When the storm of their collision finally broke, they collapsed together, a breathless tangle of limbs and racing pulses, their chests heaving in syncopated rhythm. The fire had dwindled, its once fierce flames reduced to smoldering embers that cast a soft, fading glow over their sweat-slicked forms. She turned to him, her gaze searching the depths of his shadowed eyes, and he cradled her face in his weathered hand, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that belied the ferocity of moments before. No words passed between them, none were needed. Speech felt clumsy, hollow against the weight of what they'd just shared. But this moment, this fierce entanglement, was merely the spark of something greater. To unravel the threads of how they arrived here, two souls from worlds apart, stranded on this desolate island, bound by fate and an insatiable longing, we must rewind. Back to the beginning, to the storm that tore their lives asunder, to the shipwreck that cast them into chaos, to those first tentative encounters when they were strangers, wary and uncertain, standing on the precipice of a connection neither could have foreseen. 4 years earlier, the storm had come out of nowhere, an uninvited guest crashing into their lives with reckless abandon. The sky, once a serene expanse of clear, crystalline blue that stretched endlessly above the vast ocean, had transformed in mere minutes into a menacing shroud of gray. Thick, ominous clouds rolled in like an advancing army, blotting out the sun and casting eerie shadows across the weathered deck of the ship. The waves, which had moments ago lapped gently against the hull, now rose like jagged, towering mountains of water, their white-capped peaks glinting with a wild, untamed fury. Each one crashed against the ship with a force that reverberated through the timbers. The deafening roar that seemed almost personal, as if the ocean itself had nursed a deep, ancient grudge and had chosen this moment to exact its revenge. He had been below deck when the chaos erupted, tucked away in a cramped corner of the cabin, engrossed in a worn paperback novel. The dim, flickering light of a lantern cast a warm golden glow over the pages, its flame dancing with every subtle sway of the ship. The air down there was thick with the scent of salt and damp wood, a familiar comfort to a man who had spent years at sea. His name was Elias, a grizzled 40-year-old with lines etched deep into his weathered face. Lines that told stories of hardship, loss, and a quiet resignation to a world that no longer held surprises for him. His dark hair, streaked with threads of gray, was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and his calloused hands turned the pages with a practiced rhythm. The book was an old seafaring tale, one he'd read a dozen times before, its words a steady anchor in the monotony of life aboard the vessel. She, on the other hand, had been on the upper deck, her spirit as wild and untamed as the sea itself. Her name was Clara, a 19-year-old with bright green eyes that sparkled with a hunger for adventure. This was her first real taste of the world beyond the sleepy coastal village she'd called home, and she drank it in with every breath. Her auburn hair whipped around her face in the rising wind, strands catching in her mouth as she gripped the salt-encrusted railing with both hands. She wore a faded blue jacket too big for her slight frame, and a pair of sturdy boots that had once belonged to her older brother. The air up top was sharp and briny, filling her lungs as she stared out at the horizon, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had dreamed of this, of storms and ships and the vast unknown ever since she was a child listening to her grandfather's tales by the fire. The calm had shattered without warning. The first sign was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to rise from the depths of the sea itself, a sound that vibrated through the planks beneath Clara's feet and sent a shiver up her spine. She barely had time to register it before the sky unleashed its fury. Rain came first, a sudden deluge that fell in sheets, stinging her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The wind followed, howling through the rigging with a ferocity that made the sails snap and strain against their ropes. Clara turned her face upward, squinting against the onslaught, her pulse racing as the world around her transformed into something primal and chaotic. She felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in her young life. Below deck, Elias sensed the shift too late. The lantern's flame flickered violently as the ship lurched, and the book slipped from his hands, tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. He cursed under his breath, his instincts kicking in as he steadied himself against the narrow bunk. The groans of the ship's hull were louder now, a chorus of creaks and cracks that told him this was no ordinary squall. He grabbed his oilskin coat from a hook on the wall, the fabric stiff and heavy with years of use, and pulled it on as he made for the ladder. His boots thudded against the worn rungs, each step heavier than the last, as the vessel tilted beneath him. When the first wave hit, it was like a thunderclap, made manifest. The ship shuddered violently, a bone-rattling jolt that sent Elias sprawling against the bulkhead. His shoulders slammed into the wood, and he grunted, pain flaring briefly before adrenaline dulled it. Above, Clara had no such warning. The wave struck the deck with the force of a battering ram, sending a wall of frigid water crashing over the side. She lost her grip on the railing, her hands slipping on the slick metal as the torrent swept her off her feet. Her body tumbled across the deck, a rag doll in the storm's cruel hands, until she collided with the thick base of the mainmast. The impact was brutal, a sickening crack as her head struck the unyielding wood, her limbs going limp as she crumpled to the sodden planks. Elias emerged from the hatch just in time to see her fall. The wind tore at his coat, rain blinding him as he blinked against the onslaught, but his eyes locked onto her crumpled form. Something inside him snapped, a dormant ember of protectiveness flaring to life in a way he hadn't felt in years. He'd seen too much death, too much loss, to care about much anymore, but this girl, this reckless, bright-eyed kid stirred something he thought he'd buried long ago. He roared her name into the gale, his voice swallowed by the storm, and fought his way toward her. The deck was a battlefield, slick with water and littered with debris, broken crates, tangled ropes, a splintered barrel, rolling wildly with each pitch of the ship. The wind clawed at him, pushing him back with every step, but he pressed on, his jaw set and his hands clenched into fists. When he reached her, Clara was a crumpled heap, her hair plastered to her pale face, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Blood trickled from a gash on her temple, mixing with the rainwater that pooled around her. Elias dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he brushed the hair from her eyes. She was alive, but barely. "Come on, kid," he muttered, his voice rough with urgency. "Don't you dare give up on me now." The ship groaned ominously beneath them, a deep, mournful sound that told him the end was near. The hull was splintering, the seams straining as the waves battered it mercilessly. He knew they didn't have much time, minutes, maybe less before the vessel surrendered to the sea. With a grunt of effort, Elias slid his arms beneath her, lifting her limp form against his chest. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body fragile beneath the oversized jacket, but the weight of responsibility made her feel heavier than stone. His muscles burned as he staggered to his feet, the ship tilting wildly beneath him. The lifeboat was their only chance. A small, weathered dinghy lashed to the starboard side, its canvas cover flapping in the wind. He stumbled toward it, each step a battle against the storm's relentless assault. The deck bucked and swayed, threatening to throw him overboard, but he clung to Clara with one arm and gripped the railing with the other, his knuckles white against the strain. The ropes securing the lifeboat were a tangled mess, soaked and knotted tight by the rain. Elias set Clara down gently, propping her against the base of the davit, and drew a knife from his belt. The blade was dull, its edge chipped from years of use. But it would have to do. He sawed at the ropes, his hands slipping on the wet hemp as the wind screamed in his ears. The ship lurched again, a violent shudder that sent a cascade of water over the side, soaking him to the bone. He cursed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. One rope snapped free, then another, until the boat hung precariously from its pulleys. Getting Clara into the lifeboat was a nightmare. He had to lift her over the edge, her head lolling against his shoulder as he maneuvered her limp form into the narrow hull. Her jacket caught on a splintered plank, tearing a long gash in the sleeve, but he barely noticed. His own strength was waning, his arms trembling from the effort, but he couldn't afford to falter. With a final heave, he climbed in after her, nearly tipping the boat as he fumbled with the release mechanism. The pulleys squealed as he worked them, the ropes groaning under the weight, until at last the lifeboat dropped free, plummeting into the churning sea below. The impact jarred his teeth, salt water spraying into his face as the little boat bobbed like a cork in the towering waves. He grabbed the oars, his hands raw and bleeding from the ropes, and rowed with everything he had left. The ship loomed behind them, a dying giant silhouetted against the storm-racked sky, its masts snapping like twigs as it began to break apart. Shouts echoed faintly over the wind. Other crew members, perhaps, or passengers he hadn't seen, but they were swallowed by the sea before he could make sense of them. In the end, Elias and Clara were the only ones who made it off the ship alive. The lifeboat drifted into the night, a speck of hope amid the chaos, carrying a broken man and a girl who might never wake to see the dawn. The storm raged on, indifferent to their survival, as the wreckage of their past sank into the abyss. The island was small, barely more than a dot on the map. It was uninhabited, with no signs of civilization, just dense jungle and a narrow strip of beach. When they washed ashore, they were both exhausted, their bodies bruised and battered. She was still unconscious, and he carried her to a sheltered spot under the trees, where he built a fire and waited for her to wake up. When she finally opened her eyes, she was disoriented, her gaze darting around as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. He was sitting across from her, his face shadowed by the firelight. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. "An island," he replied. "The ship, it's gone. We're the only ones who made it." She stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What about the others?" He shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't see anyone else." She started to cry then, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he didn't know how. They were strangers, thrown together by circumstance, and he wasn't sure what to say. The first few days were awkward. They barely spoke, each of them lost in their own thoughts. He spent his time building a shelter, gathering food and trying to make the island as livable as possible. She mostly stayed by the fire, staring out at the ocean, her expression unreadable. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. They started to talk, to share stories about their lives. She told him about her family, about how she had always felt trapped, like she was living someone else's life. He told her about his travels, about the places he had seen and the people he had met. They laughed together, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. The night it happened, the air was thick with an unspoken prophecy, as if the stars themselves had conspired to nudge them toward an inevitable collision. They had been sitting by the fire, as they did every night since the shipwreck had marooned them on this jagged strip of island, a ritual born of necessity and habit, a fragile tether to normalcy amid the chaos of their new reality. The fire crackled and spat, its orange glow licking at the darkness, casting fleeting shadows across the sandy clearing they'd claimed as their own. Driftwood logs, weathered smooth by the sea, formed a rough semicircle around the blaze, their surfaces cool against the heat that radiated from the flames. The distant roar of the ocean was a constant companion, a low, rhythmic growl that underscored every moment of their exile. She sat across from him, her knees drawn up to her chest, her bare feet digging into the sand. Her name was Clara, the 19-year-old with auburn hair that had grown wild and unruly in the weeks since their world had capsized. The salt water and wind had sculpted it into a tangle of curls that framed her face like a crown of thorns, glinting faintly in the firelight. She wore a tattered shirt, one of his, its sleeves rolled up past her elbows, the fabric stained with salt and sweat. Her skin was bronzed now, kissed by days under the relentless sun, and her hands fidgeted with a stick, tracing idle patterns in the sand as if searching for answers in the grains. He sat opposite her, perched on a log with his elbows resting on his knees, his broad shoulders hunched forward. Elias, 40 and weathered, was a man carved from the rough timber of a life spent at sea. His dark hair, streaked with gray, hung loose around his face, brushing the collar of his frayed jacket. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of hauling ropes and mending nets, rested idly in his lap, but there was a tension in them, a coiled energy that betrayed the calm he tried to project. His eyes, a deep hazel that held the weight of too many storms, kept drifting to her, drawn by a force he couldn't name. That night, something was different. The air between them buzzed with a tension that hadn't been there before, a current that crackled beneath the surface of their usual quiet companionship. They had survived together for weeks, sharing scavenged fish, patching the makeshift shelter of palm fronds and salvaged planks, trading of lives left behind. But this was new. It hung heavy, like the humidity before a squall, pressing against their skin, filling the spaces where words usually failed. She had been looking at him, her eyes dark pools of shadow and mystery, unreadable yet piercing, as if she could see straight through the walls he'd built around himself. He felt it then, a pull, a deep, visceral need that clawed at his chest, insistent and undeniable. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks skyward, and it was as if the sound broke some invisible chain. He leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat, and she didn't look away. Her stick fell forgotten into the sand, her hands stilling as the moment stretched taut between them. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he crossed the small distance to her side of the fire. She rose to meet him, unfolding her legs with a grace that belied the exhaustion etched into her frame, her bare feet leaving shallow imprints in the sand. The heat of the flames licked at their legs as they closed the gap, but it was nothing compared to the heat building within them. When he kissed her, it was like a dam shattering under the weight of a flood. His lips crashed against hers, rough and urgent, a release of all the tension that had been simmering for days, weeks, perhaps, if he were honest with himself. All the unspoken words, the sidelong glances, the brushes of hands as they worked side by side, the quiet nights when he'd lain awake, listening to her breathe. It all surged to the surface in that single explosive moment. She kissed him back with a desperation that matched his own. A hunger that spoke of too many nights alone, too many days staring into the void of the horizon. Her hands gripped his shirt, fingers twisting into the worn fabric, as if anchoring herself to him, as if she feared he might dissolve into the night like a mirage. It was messy, awkward, and utterly perfect. Their teeth clashed briefly, a clumsy collision born of inexperience and urgency. But neither cared. He stumbled backward, pulling her with him, and they hit the sand with a muffled thud, a tangle of limbs and ragged breaths. The coolness of the ground seeped through his jacket, a stark contrast to the furnace of her body pressed against his. Her hair fell across his face, a curtain of salt-scented strands that tickled his skin as she moved, her lips finding his again and again. His hands roamed her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the thin shirt, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath. She arched into him, her breath hitching, her fingers digging into his shoulders with a fierceness that sent a jolt through him. The firelight painted them in flickering hues of gold and shadow, their silhouettes merging into one as they surrendered to the moment. His jacket was shed, tossed aside to join the pile of driftwood, and her shirt rode up as she shifted, exposing the smooth plane of her stomach. His calloused fingers brushed against it, tentative at first, then bolder, drawing a shiver from her that he felt in his bones. She tugged at his shirt, pulling it over his head with a fumbling urgency, and the night air kissed his bare chest, raising goosebumps that her hands quickly smoothed away. There was no grace to it, no choreographed rhythm, just two people who had been alone for too long, reaching for each other in the dark, finding solace in the raw, unpolished truth of their need. The world narrowed to the space between them, the rasp of their breaths, the press of skin against skin, the faint taste of salt on her lips. The fire crackled on, oblivious to their unraveling, its warmth a distant echo of the heat they generated. She clung to him, her nails leaving faint crescent marks on his back, and he held her tighter, as if he could meld her into himself, erase the boundaries that had kept them apart. Time lost meaning, swallowed by the tide of sensation, until at last they crested that wave together, a shared release that left them trembling and breathless. Afterward, they lay tangled together, a sprawl of limbs and sweat-slicked skin on the sand. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, its light fading but still casting a soft, intimate glow over their forms. Their breaths slowly steadied, falling into a rough unison, their hearts pounding against each other through the thin barrier of flesh. The night air was cool now, wrapping around them like a blanket, and the distant waves whispered secrets they couldn't decipher. She turned to him, rolling onto her side, her eyes searching his in the dimness. They were softer now, vulnerable, stripped of the guarded edge they'd carried since the storm. He lifted a hand, cupping her face gently, his thumb brushing over her cheek in a slow, tender arc. Her skin was warm under his touch, flushed from their exertion, and he felt the faint tremor of her pulse beneath his fingers. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile and raw, in the stillness. The question hung between them, heavy with uncertainty, a thread of doubt woven into the tapestry of what they'd just shared. Her eyes held his, wide and searching, waiting for an answer he didn't have. Elias stared back at her, his mind a whirl of exhaustion and emotion. He wanted to say something profound, something that would anchor them both in this moment, but the words wouldn't come. His thumb paused on her cheek, his hand still cradling her face, and he swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "I don't know," he admitted at last, his voice rough and low, barely audible over the murmur of the sea. It was the truth, unadorned and inadequate, but it was all he could offer. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and shifted closer, resting her head against his chest. Her hair fanned out across his skin, tickling slightly, and he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her into the curve of his body. The fire's embers glowed faintly, a dying witness to their union, and the night stretched on around them. Vast and unknowable, they lay there in silence, two castaways clinging to each other in the wreckage of their old lives, uncertain of what dawn would bring, but certain, for now, of the warmth they'd found in the dark. Over the next 4 years, Clara and Elias carved out a fragile, resilient existence on the windswept island that had once been their prison. It wasn't a life of ease. Nature was a relentless adversary, testing their resolve with storms that tore at their makeshift shelter, seasons of scarce fish that left their bellies hollow, and the ever-present specter of isolation that gnawed at their spirits. Yet, from the ashes of their shipwrecked past, they built something enduring, a partnership forged in the crucible of survival. The island, with its jagged cliffs, dense thickets of wind-twisted trees, and endless stretches of sandy shore, became their reluctant home, a wild, untamed canvas on which they painted their days with sweat, determination, and an unspoken vow to make it work. The early months were the hardest. They argued over trivialities, how to ration the salvaged tins of food from the wreck, whether to reinforce the shelter with palm fronds or driftwood, whose turn it was to trek to the freshwater spring a mile inland. Clara's fiery temper clashed with Elias's stubborn pragmatism, their voices rising above the crash of waves until exhaustion forced a truce. There were moments of doubt too, nights when Clara sat staring at the horizon, her green eyes clouded with longing for the world beyond, or when Elias retreated into silence, haunted by the ghosts of a life he'd left behind. But beneath the friction lay a growing reliance, a thread of trust that thickened with each shared hardship. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood from the set of his jaw, and he came to depend on her quick hands and quicker mind to mend nets or spot the telltale ripples of a school of fish. Their shelter evolved from a crude lean-to of scavenged planks into a sturdy hut, its walls woven from palm fronds and reinforced with timber lashed together with rope, salvaged from the lifeboat. Inside, they crafted a life from the island's offerings. A bed of dried grasses covered with a tattered sailcloth, a fire pit ringed with stones where they cooked fish and boiled water, a shelf of shells and oddities Clara collected from the shore. They mastered the rhythms of the island. When the tides brought in crabs where the best coconuts grew, how to predict rain from the scent on the wind. Elias taught Clara to spear fish with a sharpened stick, his patience steadying her impulsive strikes, while she showed him how to weave baskets from reeds, her fingers deft and sure. Together they turned survival into something resembling living, a delicate balance of labor and quiet moments, watching the sun sink into the sea. Love crept in slowly, unfurling like a flower in the cracks of their rough-edged days. It wasn't the grand sweeping romance of stories. It was rawer, quieter, built on the foundation of shared glances over a flickering fire, the brush of hands as they worked side by side, the comfort of her head resting on his shoulder after a long day. They learned each other's scars, hers from a childhood fall, his from a brawl in a port tavern years ago, and their vulnerabilities, like Clara's fear of the dark or Elias's dread of being truly alone. What began as a desperate collision that first night by the fire deepened into a bond that neither could imagine breaking. They spoke of it rarely, but it lived in the way he'd leave her the ripest mango he found, or how she'd hum a tune from her village to ease his restless sleep. 2 years into their island life, their world shifted again with the arrival of their son. Clara had suspected it for weeks. The nausea, the fatigue. But when she told Elias, his face split into a rare, unguarded smile that lit up his weathered features. The birth was a trial. A long night of pain and fear under a sky streaked with stars, with Elias gripping her hand and whispering encouragement as she brought their child into the world. The boy was beautiful, a squalling bundle with Clara's piercing green eyes and Elias's crooked, infectious smile. They named him Kai, a nod to the ocean that had both destroyed and united them. A name that rolled off their tongues like a prayer. His first cries echoed through the hut, a sound that filled the empty spaces of their exile with life and purpose. Kai became their greatest joy, a living testament to the love they'd forged against all odds. His laughter, bright and unrestrained, danced through the trees as he toddled across the sand, chasing crabs with unsteady steps. His hair, a wild mop of dark curls kissed with auburn, caught the sunlight as he played, and his tiny hands grasped at the world with a curiosity that mirrored Clara's. Elias, once hardened by years of cynicism, softened in ways he hadn't thought possible, carving crude toys from driftwood, carrying Kai on his shoulders to watch the waves, teaching him to say fish with a proud grin. Clara sang to him, old lullabies from her village, her voice weaving a thread of her past into his future. Together, they marveled at his every milestone, the first tooth, the first word, the first time he splashed fearlessly into the shallows, each a small victory in their unconventional family. Their days settled into a rhythm, a fragile harmony of work and wonder. Mornings were for fishing and gathering, afternoons for repairs and play, evenings for stories by the fire as Kai nestled between them, his eyelids drooping. They dreamed cautiously of a future, perhaps a passing ship, a return to civilization. But the island had become theirs, its wildness tamed by their presence. Happiness, once a fleeting guest, took root in the soil of their shared struggles, blooming in the quiet moments. Clara's hand in Elias's as they watched Kai sleep, the warmth of their little family against the vast indifferent sea. But their happiness was not meant to last. 4 years after the storm that had stranded them, the island's deceptive calm began to fracture. It started subtly, a shift in the wind, a strange stillness in the air, but it grew into whispers of something darker. The fish grew scarce, the skies heavier with clouds that lingered too long. Clara noticed it first, her sharp eyes catching the unnatural patterns, while Elias felt it in his bones, an old sailor's instinct stirring unease. Kai, now 3, sensed it too, his usual chatter quieting as he clung closer to them. The island, their sanctuary and their cage, was turning against them, and the life they'd built stood on the edge of an abyss they couldn't yet see. The day the rescue crew arrived dawned like any other on the island. With the sun creeping over the horizon in a blaze of pink and gold, painting the restless sea in hues that shimmered like a mirage. Clara and Elias had been on that forsaken strip of land for over 4 years, their lives woven into its rhythms so deeply that the outside world had faded into a distant, half-remembered dream. The jagged cliffs, the whispering palms, the endless crash of waves against the shore. It was all they knew, a universe unto itself, where they'd built a fragile but fierce existence with their son, Kai. They'd almost forgotten the taste of bread that didn't come from pounded roots, the sound of voices beyond their own, the feel of shoes instead of sand between their toes. Yet that morning something felt different. A faint hum in the air, a shift in the wind that carried a promise they couldn't name. Clara was the first to spot it. She stood at the water's edge, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand as she shielded her eyes against the glare. Kai balanced on her hip with his chubby arms wrapped around her neck. Her auburn hair, tangled and sun-bleached, whipped around her face as she squinted at the horizon. There, cutting through the haze, was a speck, a dark silhouette against the shimmering expanse. She blinked, her breath catching, unsure if it was a trick of the light or a cruel illusion born of too many hopeless days. "Kazaias," she called, her voice sharp with urgency, cutting through the morning stillness. He emerged from the hut, his broad frame stooped slightly from years of labor, a spear in one hand and a basket of fish in the other. His hazel eyes followed her gaze, narrowing as the speck grew into the unmistakable shape of a ship. A real, solid vessel, slicing through the waves toward them. Their hearts soared, a wild, dizzying rush of hope flooding through them like a tide. Elias dropped the spear and basket, the fish spilling onto the sand unnoticed as he strode to her side. Kai, sensing their excitement, giggled and pointed, his green eyes, Clara's eyes sparkling with innocent wonder. "Boat," he chirped, his voice a bright note in the chaos of their emotions. Clara clutched him tighter, tears pricking her eyes as she laughed, a sound raw and unrestrained. Elias's hand found hers, his calloused fingers squeezing with a strength that anchored them both. For a moment they stood there, a family forged by the island's trials, daring to believe in rescue, in a return to a world they'd thought lost forever. The ship grew closer, its hull painted white with red trim, its sails taut against the wind, a beacon of salvation cutting through the endless blue. The joy was short-lived. The ship anchored just offshore and a smaller boat was lowered into the water, rowed by a crew of men in weathered uniforms. Clara and Elias watched from the shore, their anticipation tinged with a creeping unease as the boat approached. The men's faces were stern, their movements efficient, and the air seemed to thicken with something unspoken. When the boat scraped against the sand and the first man stepped out, Clara's breath hitched. He was tall, broad-shouldered with a shock of gray hair beneath a captain's cap, and a face lined with years of worry and command. She knew him instantly. Her father, Captain Daniel Harrow, the man who'd taught her to tie knots and read the stars. The man she'd last seen 4 years ago when she'd snuck aboard that ill-fated ship for her first adventure. His eyes found hers, and for a fleeting second, relief washed over his weathered features. "Clara," he rasped, his voice cracking as he stumbled forward, arms outstretched. She stepped toward him, Kai still in her grasp, her heart pounding with a mix of love and disbelief. But then his gaze shifted past her to Elias, who stood a few paces back, shirtless and sunburned, his presence a silent testament to their shared years. Then down to Kai, the boy with Clara's eyes and Elias's crooked smile, his dark curls bouncing as he squirmed in her arms. The relief in Daniel's face curdled into something darker, a storm brewing behind his steel-gray eyes. His jaw tightened, his hands falling to his sides as he took in the scene. The hut, the fire pit, the undeniable evidence of a life built without his knowledge or consent. Something inside him snapped. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for the explanations. Clara was already forming, her lips parting to spill the story of survival, love, and the child who'd bound them together. He didn't hear Elias's low, steady voice starting to say, "Sir," before it was cut off. Daniel Harrow was a man of action, not words. A captain who'd spent decades commanding ships and men through tempests and battles. The sight of his daughter, his little girl, barely 19 when she'd vanished, living wild with this grizzled stranger, A man twice her age and bearing a child who was clearly his, ignited a fury that drowned out reason. His relief at finding her alive twisted into betrayal, a visceral rage that pulsed through his veins like the sea he'd mastered. He lunged forward, his boots kicking up sand as he closed the distance to Elias. "You!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap that made Kai flinch and bury his face in Clara's shoulder. Elias raised his hands, palms out, a gesture of peace, but Daniel didn't see it, or didn't care. His fist swung, connecting with Elias's jaw in a brutal crack that sent him staggering back. Clara screamed, "Father, stop!" but her plea was swallowed by the chaos. The crewmen, 4 of them, hesitated on the shore, their eyes darting between their captain and the unfolding scene, unsure whether to intervene. Daniel didn't stop. He grabbed Elias by the collar of his tattered shirt, hauling him upright, his face inches from the younger man. "What did you do to her?" he snarled, spittle flying, his grip iron tight. Elias didn't fight back, his arms limp at his sides, blood trickling from his lip, where the punch had landed. "We survived," he said, his voice rough but calm, meeting Daniel's glare with a steady gaze. "We kept each other alive," but Daniel wasn't listening. His world had narrowed to the image of his daughter, his only child tied to this man, this stranger in a way he couldn't comprehend. He shoved Elias back, releasing him only to draw a knife from his belt, its blade glinting in the sunlight. Clara thrust herself between them, Kay crying now, her arms outstretched. "Father, please. He's my husband. Kay's father. We love each other." The words hung in the air, a desperate bridge between 2 worlds, but Daniel's rage was a wall too high to breach. He simply acted, his mind a haze of instinct and fury, the knife trembling in his hand as he advanced again, intent on severing the bond he saw as a violation of everything he'd lost and found. The island, once their refuge, became a battleground, and the dream of rescue twisted into a nightmare none of them could have foreseen. The sound of the gunshot tore through the stillness of the island, a sharp, jarring crack that reverberated off the cliffs and skimmed across the restless waves like a stone skipped over water. It was a sound so final, so absolute that it seemed to suck the air from the world, silencing the rustle of palm fronds, the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic pulse of the tide. The echo lingered, a haunting specter that hung in the humid air, as if the island itself recoiled from the violence it had witnessed. Clara's scream followed, raw and guttural, ripping from her throat with a desperation that clawed at the sky. She lunged forward, her bare feet slipping in the sand, her hands reaching for Elias, as he crumpled to the ground. But it was too late. His body hit the earth with a dull thud. A lifeless heap sprawled across the shore. Blood bloomed from his chest, a dark, spreading stain that seeped into the golden sand, turning it a sickly crimson. His hazel eyes, once so steady and alive with quiet strength, stared blankly upward, fixed on a sky he'd never see again. Clara fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the wound, as if she could push the life back into him. "No, no, no," she sobbed, her voice breaking into jagged shards, her auburn hair falling in tangled curtains around her face. The salt of her tears mixed with the salt of the sea on her skin, her fingers slick with his blood as she clutched at his shirt, willing him to move, to breathe, to defy the impossible. But he was gone. Elias, the man who'd held her through storms, who'd built a life with her from the wreckage, who'd given her a son, was gone. The warmth was already leaching from his body, his crooked smile erased forever by the bullet that had torn through his heart. Her father, Captain Daniel Harrow, stood a few paces away, the pistol still smoking in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone, his gray eyes devoid of the relief that had briefly flickered there when he'd first seen her alive. The wind tugged at his captain's coat, the tails flapping like dark wings, but he stood unmoved, his broad shoulders squared with a resolve that brooked no argument. The crewmen behind him shifted uneasily, their boots scuffing the sand, their faces pale and uncertain as they watched the scene unfold. One of them, the young man with a patchy beard, took a hesitant step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak. But a sharp glance from Daniel silenced him. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what had just happened pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You're coming home," Daniel said, his voice firm and flat, cutting through Clara's keening wails like a blade. It wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered with the authority of a man who'd spent decades bending the sea and its men to his will. He holstered the pistol with a practiced motion, the metal clinking against his belt, and took a step toward her, his boots crunching on the shell-strewn shore. Clara's head snapped up, her green eyes blazing through a sheen of tears, her face contorted with a hatred so fierce it seemed to burn the air between them. "You killed him," she whispered, her voice low and trembling, each word dripping with venom. "You killed the man I love." Her hands tightened on Elias's lifeless form, her nails digging into the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself to him, to the life they'd carved out against all odds. She looked at her father, not as a daughter, but as a woman stripped bare by grief and rage, seeing a stranger in the man who'd once cradled her as a child. Daniel's expression didn't flicker. No remorse softened his features. No doubt creased his brow. He simply reached down, his large hand clamping around her arm with a grip like iron, and yanked her to her feet. She stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her, but he didn't relent. Her cries for Elias turned to shrieks of protest as he dragged her away from the body, her heels digging furrows in the sand. "Kai," she screamed, twisting in his grasp to look back at her son, who stood frozen near the hut, his tiny face crumpled with confusion and fear. The 3-year-old's dark curls bounced as he took a tentative step forward, his green eyes, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "Mama," he whimpered, his small voice nearly lost in the wind. But Daniel didn't pause. He hauled Clara toward the waiting boat, leaving Kai behind, a solitary figure on the shore beside the lifeless form of his father. The crewmen scrambled to assist, 2 of them grabbing oars while the others steadied the boat against the lapping waves. Clara fought, her fists pounding against her father's chest, her legs kicking wildly, but his strength overwhelmed her. He shoved her into the boat, her body collapsing onto the wooden bench as she gasped for breath, her sobs ragged and unrelenting. The boat rocked as Daniel climbed in, barking orders to the crew in a voice that brooked no dissent. The oars dipped into the water, pulling them away from the island, the shore shrinking with each stroke. Clara twisted to look back, her hands gripping the edge of the boat, her heart splintering as Kai's small silhouette grew fainter, his cries swallowed by the distance and the roar of the sea. On the ship, a sturdy vessel named the Resolute. Its hull weathered by years of service, Clara was a prisoner in all but name. Her father locked her in a cramped cabin below deck, its walls damp and stained with salt, its single porthole offering a taunting glimpse of the ocean that had once been her refuge. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and tar, and the constant creak of the ship's timbers mocked her with its familiarity. She sat on the narrow bunk, her knees drawn to her chest, her mind a tempest of grief and fury. Elias's face haunted her, his steady gaze, his rare laugh, the feel of his hand in hers, and Kai's absence was a physical ache, a hollow in her chest where her son's warmth should have been. Her father's words echoed in her skull. "You're coming home," but home was the island now, the life she'd built with the man he'd gunned down without a second thought. She bided her time, her anger hardening into a blade she sharpened with every passing hour. The ship sailed northward, the days blurring into a haze of gray skies and rolling waves, the crew's murmurs filtering through the walls as they whispered about the captain's daughter and the blood on the sand. Daniel visited her once, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, his face still unyielding. "This is for your own good," he said, his tone clipped, but she didn't answer, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. She watched him, memorizing the lines of his face, the way he shifted his weight, the rhythm of his breath. She waited for the right moment, her resolve crystallizing into something cold and unshakable. It came on the 5th night, under a moonless sky that cloaked the ship in shadow. The crew was weary, their vigilance dulled by routine, and Daniel stood alone at the helm, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the ship's lantern. Clara slipped from the cabin, the lock's rusty latch yielding to a hairpin she'd scavenged from the bunk's straw mattress. Her bare feet were silent on the deck, her tattered shirt fluttering in the night breeze as she crept toward him, a knife, one of the crew's pilfered from a table, clenched in her hand. Her father never saw it coming. She struck with the precision of a woman who'd speared fish to survive, the blade sinking into his back between his shoulder blades. He gasped, a choked sound that barely escaped his lips, and stumbled forward, clutching the wheel as his knees buckled. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, pulling the knife free and striking again, her grief and rage pouring into each thrust until he slumped to the deck, his blood pooling dark and slick beneath him. The crew found her standing over him, the knife still in her hand, her face a mask of defiance and exhaustion. They didn't dare touch her, not then, not with the fire in her eyes and the blood on her hands. She took control, her voice steady as she ordered them to turn the ship back to the island, back to Kai. They obeyed, fear and awe mingling in their gazes, and when the Resolute anchored once more off the familiar shore, she leapt into the water without a word, swimming through the waves to reach her son. Kai ran to her as she staggered onto the beach, his small arms wrapping around her legs, his sobs muffled against her. She knelt, pulling him close, her tears mingling with his, as she whispered his name over and over. The hut stood silent behind them, Elias's body gone, buried perhaps by the crew in her absence. But his presence lingered in the air, in the life they'd built. She returned to the island, to her son, to the echoes of their family, but nothing would ever be the same. The sand bore the scars of that day, the wind carried the weight of loss, and Clara, now a widow, a mother, a killer, stood alone with Kai, facing a future rewritten in blood.